Hey everyone, Hager Studios here. I'm going to be walking you through a little painting I did of my daughter. She was out yesterday as the snow was melting, and as you can see, she was kind of walking through some puddles in the yard that were forming from the melting snow. And I saw her out the kitchen window and decided to grab the camera quick and take a picture. I really enjoyed getting those just kind of random moments that just kind of catch my eye. It's kind of fun. So that's the reference. You can see it in the bottom left corner of the screen there. And I'll start off by apologizing. I didn't realize that my camcorder card ran out of room roughly halfway through the painting here. So unfortunately, some of the process is not captured, but most of it is, and I'll definitely show you the end, how it turned out. So here's kind of a sped up version of just the initial sketch. I wasn't totally thrilled with my drawing in the end. I realized that her head is not close enough to the top of the panel. I cropped my images in Photoshop to be the exact same dimension as my painting panel, which in this case is a 9 by 12. And so in that, for that reason, you can kind of judge the proportions of things and the placement of things on the canvas. But that was a misjudgment on my part to start her head farther down than it is in the reference, and it worked out in the end. I didn't end up changing it because it was fine. It wasn't a huge deal. A lot of times I'll put a little guide in the Photoshop image, just a few guides to show where some placement is, and then measure out and duplicate those guides on the canvas, and that's helpful. I'll probably show that in a future video, how exactly I do that. It's real simple. I don't do a full grid. Just draw a few guides to show where major components are in the piece, and that just helps me with placement in the beginning in my sketch. I still draw things freehand. I don't trace anything, but as far as the exact placement, sometimes the composition relies heavily on that, and so I do put a few guides down just to make sure that my placement is exactly correct, because I tweak the composition and the placement in the reference very thoroughly. So here I'm just laying in kind of that watercolor. The challenge in this one for me, and what I've struggled with before, is truly seeing water correctly, seeing the transparency as well as the reflection on top. And so that was I'll say a fun part of this one. I think it's relatively effective in the end, but I'm definitely wanting to do more of that just to train myself to perceive that correctly. In the end, all you should have to do is just squint at your reference, whether a photograph or painting from life, and just duplicate the values and the temperatures, and it should come out correctly. But I find a lot of times I get fooled by water reflections, and so that's always a challenge. But here I'm just seeing it as some warm values. I'm trying to get the warm tones in the water, and now I'm moving towards the snow. There's a tree in the reference to the right of the frame that's kind of casting a shadow across behind her, the branches of the tree. This was late afternoon sun. And I sort of apologize for the color of the video too. It looks like I'm making the shadows gray. They're not, in fact, gray in the painting. It's more of a blue, purple. But they come across as gray on the video, so that's not entirely accurate. But I try to get the color as close as I can. So I have to say that this was a late night start for me, and I'm starting it rather careless. I look back, I wish I would have maybe not included that shadow stroke kind of over above her head to the left. That ended up being an issue later as far as trying to get pure white snow up there. You see in the reference the tree shadow isn't really up there, and I was just trying to rough things in and be quick and free with the brush strokes and got a little careless there. So that's one of those things that if you've been painting for a while, you tend to think, well, I can be a little careless in the beginning and just kind of rough and block things in and get away with it. And sometimes you can. But I have to caution myself all the time that even though I've been painting for 20 years, I still have to be really conscious and focus whenever I pick up a brush, and not be too arrogant to think that I can get away with anything in any amount of carelessness, because that's not the case, or you certainly do suffer for it. So this was one of those cases I should have reminded myself to really focus and not be so arrogant to think that I can do whatever I want in the beginning. So again, I'm just trying to map out where those shadow areas fall. What I'm trying to do in this initial stage is just get a rough map of the placement and rough values of everything. Values meaning light and dark, as if you were viewing it as a black and white image. And I'm going to come back afterwards, after I'm kind of done with this initial lay-in, and kind of scrape it off with a palette knife, just so there's no heavy paint on. And then I came back the next morning and finished up the painting. So again, I'm just going for a rough map, a rough plan of attack for how the rest of the painting is going to go. I'm not planning on finishing this in one sitting. So here I'm just noticing the dark shapes and the shadows of her shirt, and just putting a dark green color in there. All I'm thinking of here is just basic color as far as the local color, meaning, she's wearing a green shirt, so I'm making the shadow color a green. I'm not being overly fussy about hitting the exact green. I just want a dark green that isn't way off. I'm not worried about anything else. I'm going to go back in and bring some light into those shadows later. Again, so at this stage I'm not being overly fussy about that. So there, I'm just looking to get the shape of her hair. And again, all I'm looking for there is just a dark warm. As far as the exact color, I don't care. I'm just looking for a dark warm, because that's all I see. If you squint down at the reference, it's just a dark warm brown, or whatever you want to call it. But I'm trying to get, well, the longer I've painted, the more I get in the habit of just seeing things as a value and a temperature. So I'm looking at her hair and I'm seeing a dark warm, and I'm looking at her shadow on her shirt and just kind of seeing a dark warm. Yeah, I made it a little bit of a green color, but overall I'm seeing a dark warm color. Here I'm seeing a dark cool color. It's the blue shirt sticking out below her sweatshirt, and the same on her pants or jeans. It's just a dark cool. That's all I'm seeing. I don't care about the exact color. I'm just going for more of the shape, the drawing of it at this point, and I'll refine that later. You certainly could take more time in this initial block in to really nail down the exact color and value and temperature. And especially if you're painting directly or alla prima and you want to finish this in one sitting, you probably want to do that. I find that it's helpful to me to get this initial map done, and just lay down a basic plan so I know where everything is, and basically I guess get the drawing laid down and nailed down in these initial stages, and then come back later, either after the painting is dried or after I've scraped it off, and then start painting more directly. And so that was my plan for this one, is to get the initial lay-in done, try to get the overall piece working as a whole in this initial stage as far as just values, and then come back later and paint more directly. So here again, I'm just refining that. Again, it's more about drawing and values at this stage. I want dark values where dark values are, and light where light is, and get those shapes correct, or at least pretty close. So here I'm drawing her shadow that she is casting from the sunshine and the water. And again, this is where, to me at least, maybe until I paint water more, this is where water gets tricky, because you get her shadow and her reflection. And in this initial block, and I didn't actually put her reflection in, but they're completely different looking. Her shadow is a cool dark value cast on the water, and her reflection, you'll see going straight down below her, is a what a reflection does is eliminates the glare, the indirect light glare from, I guess, the sky. And so in her reflection, you actually see down into the water more accurately. You see the grass and stuff down in the water because there's no glare on the water in her reflection. And so then it ends up being, the color of the warm dead grass because there's no glare on the water. And so trying to think through all these things, and maybe that's the key, is not necessarily trying to think through them and make sense of them. It's just simply observing and putting down what you see. And in the end, of course, you have to do that. But trying to make sense of what you see with water, I find at least to be a real challenge. And again, I hope to, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see how light plays off water and interacts with a subject moving through it. It's always something that if you pull it off accurately in a painting, to me it's kind of magical. And so that's one of the things that attracted me to this subject when I saw her out there, and I knew the light was nice, and she's going to be splashing around or wading around in that puddle for a while. I knew I wanted to grab the camera and get something. I took probably 10 frames, and this was the one that I thought, kind of gave me a chance to do something interesting. So here I'm just trying to find these ripples, and it ended up being quite a labor throughout the duration of the painting to actually find those. I ended up going back and refining and repainting quite a bit to try to make that make sense and really get the feeling of her moving through that water and the water moving in front of her. To me, that's kind of the key of the painting, is how that water comes across. I guess you could say that's my subject, and so I really did concentrate on that quite a bit. She's holding her hair in an interesting way. I'm not sure exactly why she's holding it like that. It's not like it's going to get wet in the water. Maybe it's subconscious that she's kind of grabbing it and trying to keep it dry subconsciously, even though it's nowhere near the water. But I'm glad she did. It offered some real interest. To me, if she had her hands down at her sides and her hair was just falling forward, not that it couldn't be a interesting painting still, but to me it adds a lot more interest that her hands are up and her hair is out. I enjoyed that gesture. Again, to me, just added a lot more interest to her pose. And kids are funny. They, of course, if you tell them you're going to paint a painting of them or you want a picture of them, they totally get cheesy and give you the big smile. But boy, if you can catch them in an unguarded moment, you get some of the most interesting poses and gestures there. They're so uninhibited if they don't know you're watching, of course. I guess it's like anybody. But I get a kick out of catching them in unguarded moments and interesting poses like this. So again, here I'm trying to map out the shadows again. I could have been probably a little more accurate with the shadows. Of course, the shape of an object is very much suggested by the shadows that either fall across it or the shadows that it throws. So shadows are very important in a painting as far as the drawing. They really do suggest the shape of whatever you're drawing. If you draw your shadows just flat and careless, well, here I'll say that I'm scraping off excess paint. I'm done for the night. I got my initial block in. A lot of the initial values, so there I'm done. Time for bed. So here I'm the next morning. I'm wearing my Viking sweatshirt. Go Vikes. And now I have in my mind that I'm going to start painting a little more directly. Here I'm holding up colors that I mixed with my knife next to the painting and kind of seeing where I'm at as far as value. And so the idea, like I said, is to paint a little more directly. And what I mean by painting directly is trying to get finished work down on the canvas and leave it. Now, realistically, as I paint, it's not going to totally happen every time, but my goal is to paint it correctly such that what I do put down could be the last stroke in that area and describe it completely. In other words, I'm not planning on coming back later and modifying things if I don't have to. I want to paint correctly. I want to nail the color and the value and just get everything right. Okay, and we're back. I had to take a little bit of a break in my recording because I got interrupted, but back at it now. So you see I'm just going in and trying to get some of that cooler sky reflection. If you study water, you'll notice that out further towards the horizon, of course, the water reflects more of the sky. As it comes closer to you and you're looking straight down into it, you lose some of that, and it's a gradual thing. And so I'm looking for that in the reference, and I can see it, and I'm conscious of that as I'm painting, that towards the bottom of the painting, the water will be less cool. It'll be reflecting less of the sky, so you'll see me, I'm warming up a little bit towards the bottom. It's not that the water doesn't reflect the sky, it's just not as strong as you get more perpendicular to the surface of the water. And I'll apologize again because I end up, when I get working more detailed on the figure, I end up blocking out with my head much of the view. And I didn't realize I was doing that as I was painting, but I apologize for that. I'll correct that in future videos. So here I'm putting in her reflection. And again, this to me is what's fascinating about painting water surfaces like this. What her reflection is doing is it's eliminating the glare from the sky on the surface of the water. And so her reflection is actually just a warmer, darker value, which is the water and the grass underneath the water minus the glare from the sky, if that makes sense. And so you can kind of think through this in a logical way as far as what you're seeing and then therefore how to paint it. But then it's also important to be very true to what you observe. There's always that balance in painting. Excuse me, my chair makes noise. There's that balance in painting. You can have an understanding of things, say anatomy, for instance. You can definitely understand anatomy, and it can be an aid to you. But an understanding of anatomy never takes the place of careful observation. And when in doubt, always go with what you see. Because if you paint what you know or what you think you know, and it's not true to what's visually there, it's going to look off. So your observation and your vision always trumps your knowledge. And so that's always good to keep in mind. And so here, I'm trying to logically understand these ripples and what they're reflecting and why. But then also just being true to the reference, because that's what, reference is for. These days we're so lucky we have phenomenal photography equipment not only the cameras themselves and what they're able to capture, but then the ability to take it in the computer and manipulate it and tweak little nuance of light and color. And I often wonder, some of the great artists in the past that were so true to painting from life, Sargent, for instance, I wonder how he would take advantage of modern photography equipment, because obviously back then great artists painted from life because that, to a large degree, was their best reference. Even though life moves and the light changes, they didn't have the photography equipment that we have today to really capture so close to what we actually see. It's still, no camera can still capture exactly and to the depth and degree that we observe with our eyes, but man, they're good. And if you understand where the camera falls short, you can go into the software and lighten up the shadows and really have your way with these images that we take. And so it's an amazing thing to have the quality of reference that we do. And so be true to it. That's what I tell myself. I educate myself as much as possible as far as, like I said, anatomy, and but we have these phenomenal reference photos that we can capture ourselves and work from. So in the end, your observation is the most important thing, and being true to what you see. So here I'm going back in and reinforcing some of the darks in her hair. I'm kind of reassessing the temperature and the color of her hair, maybe steering it away from certain reds and more towards the golden brown. I'm introducing some greens into her hair to kind of neutralize some of the red. I remember it being kind of rusty red. And I'm going in and kind of trying to refine her face. And again, this is a sketch. I'm not so much interested in a perfect likeness of her. It's so small that you probably couldn't get that anyway. So I'm squinting down and looking at her face in the reference and just trying to get the abstract shapes of what I know to be her face, but I'm not thinking of it as a face when I'm painting it. I'm analyzing the foreshortening of her head as it's tilted down, and just studying the abstract forms, not thinking of it as a face. That's the key to true drawing, is to eliminate your identification of the subject. If you draw an eye, you don't think of it as an eye. You think of it as shapes. And if you're true to what you see and draw those shapes correctly, in the end, it'll look like an eye. But all you're really doing is drawing angles and shapes and analyzing the proportions and the relationships of certain shapes to others. And it's like a big jigsaw puzzle. But in the end, if you're true to what you perceive, then things will look correct. And then beyond that, where the true artistry comes in, is your ability to edit and establish an aesthetic beyond pure perception. In other words, you can simplify certain shapes. You don't have to draw them to their complete detail if it's not necessary. And that's where your artistic license comes in, and that's where an artist truly becomes an artist. But those are some deeper philosophical things that we don't need to get into with this little piece. So I'm just analyzing the negative shapes of her hair with her hand and her sleeve, and then again looking at the abstract features of her face, trying to refine that. I'm analyzing the shadow side versus the warm side, or the light side, there's still warmth in the shadow side. Your skin tones very seldom actually go cool as far as leaning towards blue in color temperature, I mean. So I'm conscious of still maintaining warmth in her face, even in the shadow side. But if you see her face, you think about her face, I'm not seeing any of her eyes. Her eyes are just kind of a dark line. I'm basically seeing her eyelids as she's looking down. Her head is tilted down and her eyelids are covering her eyes, and so I guess I see her eyelashes would be the dark part. I see very little of her mouth below her nose. Again, so the face at this angle is not a classical face. And that's no problem. You just have to be true to what you see and draw it that way. If you don't see much of her mouth in the reference, then don't, give her chin or mouth below her nose. Her nose is the most prominent thing in this angle. It's catching the light from the side there. So these are all the things that I'm thinking about. And I'm not getting hung up on little fussy details. Her hands, for instance, her hand will be her left hand. It's on the right side of the painting that I'm painting now. It's basically the top of her hand is facing the light. So it's a value, a pretty bright value. And then her fingers are facing more towards her head, and they're grabbing her hair. So they're facing more or less the sky, or away from the light source, the sun. And so her fingers are a completely different value than the back of her hand, and I'm just summarizing them as being that way. So the back of her hand is just a simple brushstroke or two in a certain value, and then her fingers are another brushstroke or two in a darker value, and the values are correct, but I'm not getting caught up in delineating every finger, every knuckle. I see indications to some degree in the reference of her fingers and knuckles, but those things aren't going to determine the success of my painting, and so I'm not getting overly fussy with those types of details. In other words, I want to get the big shape of the hand, I want to get those values correct, the temperature correct, but details I'm not really worried about. This is just a sketch, and its success isn't going to depend on those details. I am being very conscious to be true to shapes and proportions when I'm drawing the figure like this, though, because our eye will catch if something is off very readily in a figure like this. We see people around us every day. We're very conscious of somebody who maybe has some impairment and who may not walk correctly, or if somebody's posture is off or proportion is off for some reason. Those are the things that we as human beings really pick up on quickly in somebody else. And so in a painting it's no different. If somebody is painted and the proportions are off, legs are too long or whatever, those are the things that may not even be able to name it consciously what is the issue, but instinctively you'll know when you look at something, it just doesn't look right. And even somebody who's not a trained artist will be able to identify that something's off. And so for that reason I'm very conscious about making sure proportions, especially in a figure, are correct, and that it all reads together well. Again, I apologize for the head blocking the subject. You can get to know the back of my head really well by the end of the video. Of course, as I was painting, I had no understanding that I was doing that. I was just concentrating on the painting itself. So one of the great things about painting is that time just kind of stands still, and you're not conscious of time while you work or much of anything else. You're able to really kind of lose yourself in paint as you work. Okay, so I apologize again. I had painted for a while and then realized that my video card on my camera had run out of space, and so here for the most part the painting is at a more complete state, and I've cleared the card and I'm painting again now. So you'll see I put a lot of the grass in the foreground. I finished her pants, and again, I'm not looking for hyper detail there. I'm just the major structure of her pants, the major wrinkles I wanted to put in. And now I'm just going back and touching some of the things that still don't ring true somehow. The value of that cast shadow on the water was an interesting thing. It's darker and cooler than the water around it, but not by much. I mean, it's distinct in a way, but it doesn't depart. It doesn't even depart as much as that I have it here. Like I probably from the video, probably should tone that down a little bit as far as bringing the values closer together from the cast shadow on the water to the water next to it. It's not that much darker, but maybe that's just in the video. But you'll see me squint over at the monitor and really analyze the values of those things. And squinting, if I haven't talked about that, is just simplifying. It's a way to really observe the relationships of the values in your subject. So in other words, if you squint at that reference photo, you can see how much darker that cast shadow on the water is than the water that surrounds it. You may not see everything else correctly as far as its actual value and color, but you'll see the relationship better when you squint. And squinting is a way of eliminating extemporaneous detail and really understanding the big picture of your painting and not losing that. You squint, you simplify, and see the big shapes. So here I'm just going after that light on her shirt. I don't think it was quite the light value that it should have been, facing the sun as it does. You see the shadows on the snow in the video kind of look gray, and in the painting they're not. They are more of a bluish purple. But then you'll also see some teal, sort of turquoise notes. I was just kind of having fun with the snow. If you ever studied snow, you notice that there's all sorts of color in snow. There's pinks and blues, of course, but then there's also some greens and teals. There's all this reflected light from everywhere, and so you can have a lot of fun with snow as far as interjecting colors, as long as your values are true. And so I was doing some of that here. And you can see some of the turquoise notes in the snow, some of the cooler, lighter blues. I think I'm revisiting some things on her face here. Again, I apologize that I'm blocking the view of what I'm actually doing. But I think I'm revisiting some of her face and her shadow side of her face. I remember warming up a little bit. So now I'm going to go back in and add some shadows under the grass. These are just a little bit darker than the reflected tone of the water, and it makes you feel like you can kind of see through the water a little more. It eliminates some of the glare, in essence. So that's what I was trying to do here. If this was a larger painting and not just a small sketch, I would take much more time and truly develop the water to a greater degree. And basically all I'm concerned about here is the main colors and values. Just getting it so it'll read and communicate the light that was actually there. Beyond that, I'm not so much worried about it. I'm making sure that that reflection stands out because it is quite a bit darker than the surrounding water. Then I'm going back and adding some of the glare back in. It's possible to get a little fussy at this stage. You could kind of pick at it forever. So I'm telling myself that as I'm painting that, at a certain point I just got to be done with this thing. It is what it is. It's a little sketch, and if it's effective, it is. If it's effective, it's effective. But it's hard not to keep messing with it, because you'll always see little things that you think, oh, I need to touch that, or oh, this is bugging me, or there. Actually, now watching this video, I'm glad I did what I just did there, because that was bugging me. There, that's better. And now I'm adding some darker warms to right where her foot meets the water. There's a lot of contrast in that area down there, and I'm trying to be true to that. Well, I think that's about it. I'll put a finished picture of it in the end here. Thanks for watching, and if you like it, feel free to subscribe. There'll be more videos coming, more instruction. Hopefully it was helpful to you and you enjoyed it. Thanks, bye.